So you guys have already seen the video from Anne about colorist versus real colors and how you can use exaggeration in both the hue and saturation from what you would normally see in nature. You can kind of push those colors in the hue and saturation as long as the value is kept intact. So I have a few examples here, and on the left is an example of using high contrast colors. So we've got complementary colors here, and it's like you've taken this bright orange and this blue color and you have the exact same amount of pigment, but you used all the pigment in one place for the accent color, and for the dominant color it's been diluted and spread out. So it's sort of using the same amount of saturation but squeezing it all into one spot for a focal point, which is like right in that golden ratio spot. Really draws your attention to that spot. So in some of these other pieces, there's a lot more saturation throughout the whole piece. But this one, the colors just seem to be really bright everywhere. But if I were to really analyze these pieces and look at the colors, really dissect the saturations, you would see that a lot of the painting is actually quite desaturated, and that these desaturated colors are right next to fully saturated colors, and that is what really makes them stand out. And if you don't know it from this whole semester yet, there's one takeaway that I want you to go home with. It's that relative use of saturation that really makes colors seem bright. So if you had covered this whole thing with equal saturation, the colors would actually seem less vivid than they do when you contrast them with both hue and saturation. So in this one, the saturation again varies greatly. So if I go into like quite a lot of desaturated colors, and just a few spots in here in these brighter colors where there's some really saturated colors. This one seems to just jump off the page with vibrating color. And if you remember, if you haven't seen the control paint video from Matt Core on simultaneous contrast, please watch that now. But what's making that happen is having this contrast in hue right next to each other without a contrast in value. So if I put a grayscale on top of this, those places where you saw the purple right next to the red and the red seemed to jump out, those values are actually very, very similar, so that the piece is quite dull when you take the color out. Large chunks of the same gray cover an area that's actually lots of different colors when you turn the color layer back on. So you can look at that in some of these other pieces here. This one seems to be a rainbow from left to right, and when you turn the color off, it's really just 3 or 4 chunks of value with very little variation. And you can see there's also quite a bit of variation in saturation as well as hue. So there's a few places where the saturation really pops out in the transitions between two colors, and that helps make the colors look really vivid. So turn that black and white layer off again, and there you can see the bits of saturation popping out in between the colors. Here again, you have a completely different path when you turn the color on. Just look at the contrast between the two as it goes on and off, and you'll see that there's just wild colors in the clouds and in the fields. This one's really great because like the whole ground here is sort of one big chunk of gray when you turn the colors off, but there's so many colors in the piece, and yet it still reads naturally. So here I have some 10-step values from Fundamentals of Light and Value. You guys would have done some last year. You also have some thumbnails that you would have done interior values in as well, and I encourage you to use those for the assignment. So what I've done here is I've actually put a gradient map on them to change them to a reddish underpainting, and I've actually swapped some of the values right in the middle so that one of my mid-ground layers is actually really, really bright, which gives the impression of light hitting a section of the mid-ground. If you have your originals with all your layers separate, that'll be a lot easier for you, but I didn't have that, so I just went in and swapped some values in them. And I'm going to use these as underpaintings to colorize. And I'm going to do this with a black and white layer on top so that I can quickly go back and forth and test and see if the colors that I'm adding are the same value as the colors that I have underneath. So you can see I've got a black and white layer on top of my, on top with my gradient map underneath that, and I'll have another layer on top of that for color. So I'm just going to use my regular thick paintbrush, and I'm going to choose one of these thumbnails to do, so I'll do this one down here, and I've picked a reddish color, and it's a little too dark, so I'm going to go back in and lighten it, and I'm testing because I want those values to match. And I don't know how well you'll see any kind of discrepancies in the video, but I can see that that value is just a little bit too dark. So that one seems to match well, and I'm just painting in a new color on top of my underpainting. And you don't necessarily have to keep your black and white layer on. It doesn't really matter. You can just go back and forth and check. It's really just there. Every time you're picking a color, you want to just double check that your value matches the values that you're painting over. Now, the more complex the piece that you have with internal values, the more challenging this would be to do without the black and white layer on, because you'll be having to switch your colors a bit more. So I want to do the moss hanging off with a little bit more of a green color, and because I'm painting with red, I don't have to go fully green to have this read as a little bit green. I can go very desaturated and a yellowish red, and it should read as being a little bit green. And those colors will jump out because they're right next to each other in the same value. So I'll go back to sort of a rusty color for the other tree. So the rest of the video, I have sped up the painting a little bit, and I'm filling in this foreground with mostly dark, warm, not very saturated colors. So that's two things that don't draw the eye, dark and not saturated, relatively, in the foreground, and warm colors does draw the eye. And then in this mid-ground here, I'm going a little bit more saturated and a little bit more cool, so it's getting brighter. And in this one, I do a couple of spots of saturated green, and then I mix it with a darker, well, not darker, the same value but desaturated. And I make sure to match the value and fill that in, and just giving a little bit of a breakup in saturation helps to pull the eye and make it seem a little bit more vivid. So that's a high contrast between hues there, but not a really, really high contrast between values. So we're varying the types of contrast. We're contrasting hue, saturation, and value in different places. So I'm getting some warmer colors in here, and I should mention that you have these 10-step values assignments from last semester with internal values as well, or you should, and you should have them already created with different arrangements of values, so that it's not just the darkest value to the lightest value in 10 steps. So you can pick whatever composition that you want from that, and if you don't have any with internal values, I do recommend that you add in some internal values as well. This is really simple, and it would look better with a little bit more form lighting on each layer, especially the lit layer in the midground that's lighter, so that layer should really have a shadow side to it to be complete. And as you can see, I'm also varying the hue in that layer that's getting into the background, so I made that more, I'm getting more into the blues to contrast with that bright mid-ground. So I'm going bluer and bluer as I go back, because that's what atmosphere does. in that sort of mid background where I went sort of a dark purpley blue, I added in a little bit of a slightly greener tint, which really just meant going almost gray, just a little towards the yellower colors. And then I'm getting a nice pop of light lavender in the background, making sure always with my grayscale layer that I'm matching the values in the background, and a really, really light blue back there. Okay, and then because I've already got some mixed colors in the foreground that match the values, I can go ahead and mix those up in there, and it gives it a little bit of life. It pops out because of the contrast in hue, and just kind of mixing up the hue a little bit in each layer. That's it, so enjoy the assignment.